If you're watching this video, it's because you're clearly interested in finding ways to be able to improve your endurance performance. My name's Nick Jankowskis. I'm a sports scientist here with Mets Performance. And in this video, we're going to take you through how we use physiological data to better inform your training. And where a lot of it starts is being able to test in the first place. I mean, any form of testing is going to give us a bit of insight in terms of what we're doing. And that's really where the process starts. So regardless of if you're coming into the lab or doing some of your own testing at home, getting some information is a really critical point to be able to understand how our body actually responds to physiological tasks, whether that be a ramp test, whether that be a time trial. At the end of the day, the best way to do that would be go out and race, but it's not always practical to race week in, week out, particularly if you're a long course endurance athlete, if you're going for Ironman or marathons. We can't just race all the time. We can't race every 4 weeks, for example. But what we can do is we can do these tests along the way to be able to identify how our physiology is changing and sort of map out, are we heading in the right direction and where are some opportunities that we can improve. So the two really key types of formalized testing sessions come in field and lab-based tests. Field-based tests, you might be familiar with things like 2K time trials or going and doing a 20-minute FTP test, and I'm going to use that as an example in a moment. Whereas lab tests are things like exactly what Tyler's doing in the picture here. Mask on in a controlled environment, maybe on a treadmill or on the cycle ergometer, on a kicker like I've got behind me, and doing a test where we're measuring a lot of physiological characteristics and variables. And really, I want to highlight initially what the differences between these two methods are, because both are going to give us some information on how we're going and maybe some points that we can use from a training perspective. So when we start with a field test like the FTP test, it's a classic. Most cyclists and triathletes would have done one. You can see from a picture here of me doing one a little while ago. They're not easy. They're quite difficult and challenging, but it's the type of thing that it's going to give us some information. So what do we get from a 20-minute FTP? Well, we get data. We get a number, even more simply, and that's what our estimated FTP is. And it's a pretty good estimate. For the most part, we take 95% of our 20-minute power. Let's say it came out at 240 watts. That's great. It tells us what our FTP is, and this has pretty good relationship with what we find in the lab usually anyway. But it's only telling us 1 point. It tells us 240 watts. We don't know what contributed to enabling that output. What allowed us to get to 240 as an FTP rather than 210 or 220? On the flip side, what are the limiting factors? We don't know those either. What prevented us? We might feel like, it was my legs or my breathing or whatever. I couldn't push the power for long enough. What are the limiting factors? We have this sensation of feeling, but we can't pinpoint exactly what is stopping us from getting to 250 or 260. And what it's not telling us is what's the most effective methods of training to be able to implement to improve this FTP or improve our endurance performance. We're basically guessing. On the flip side though, if we go to a lab test, that's where we get all the context. So we're still getting data. We can still find that FTP might be 240, but we get the context behind it. And we answer a series of questions I put up here. This is a way of being able to see what is actually going into that performance. And really that context is key. So things like how big is our engine? What is our VO2 max? And what intensity could we produce at max? What's the relationship between FTP and VO2 max? Do we hold a high percentage of our engine, a moderate percentage, or a low percentage? That gives us an insight in terms of opportunities of should we target maybe more threshold-based training or should we target more aerobic power? Those are going to be different based on how our responses interact. Things like how did our air intake interact with our oxygen transport or our cardiovascular system and the utilization part of the muscle. Are there any clear limiting factors? Was blood lactate an influence? Was our ventilation an influence? Was it muscular endurance? Did we physiologically find it pretty comfortable? For example, was blood lactate low, but our RPE or perception of exertion was quite high, relatively speaking? All of these things we're going to get a lot more context from, and we're going to be able to build out a pretty clear picture as to what's going on now, but then also it really starts to guide us down the path of how we can improve and perform better. So when it comes to measuring some of this, we need to look at, well, what are the 3 key components of endurance and how do they relate to the testing? And that's where we're going to take you now. So when we look at endurance, we break it down really simply. There's 3 major components that every endurance athlete needs to work on to be able to improve their performance. And that comes down to these 3: aerobic power, aerobic capacity, and our lactate threshold. So let's start with capacity. Our aerobic capacity fundamentally is our ability to consistently reproduce efforts for an extended period of time or produce the same intensity over an extended period of time. Most of you are going to be familiar with building the Ks in the legs. It's our zone 2, long, slow, continuous training. From a physiological perspective, it's all about our ability to use oxygen effectively. Can we use more oxygen? Can we minimize the anaerobic contribution and ultimately minimize the blood lactate accumulation? And can we just keep putting one foot in front of the other at the end of a race or during a race, particularly the longer the event goes on, aerobic capacity is really, really critical. We've got to build the Ks and legs. That's a fundamental of endurance, absolute basics. And from how this implements in the data and what we're getting from a physiological testing perspective, here's a great case study. So the first one we'll show you here is Matt, who's a cyclist. We did some testing on him a little while ago. The orange line is his initial test. The blue line represents his post-test, so 4 months later. And we measured his heart rate as a key indicator of how his aerobic capacity improved. So what we can clearly see on this graph here is the blue line's much lower than the orange line. We also note that the blue line goes out a lot further. We start at the same intensity and increase by the same 30 watts every 3 minutes in both tests. You can see he got much further. What we did was taking his initial testing data, we looked at blood lactate, we looked at his ventilation responses, we looked at his heart rate, and we built out some really specific training zones for him to make sure his zone 2 training was really targeted. That long, slow, continuous work was being very specific to a particular heart rate range and thereby increasing the quality of his higher volume sessions. What's our adaptation? Well, a large adaptation from doing that work correctly and strategically is improving our stroke volume, increasing the size of the left ventricle, pumping more blood out per beat, so our heart doesn't have to beat as frequently. What it means is when we sit on a lower sub-maximal intensity, you can see towards the left and middle of this graph, it means his heart rate's significantly lower than what it was previously for the same work. It means our bodies are much more effective and efficient at using that oxygen or transporting that oxygen around the system, and it means it's going to be more sustainable for us. It's going to be less fatiguing. We'll be able to repeat it more continuously. That's a really clear improvement in someone's aerobic capacity, and largely it's going to do that or improve from doing that really targeted zone 2 work and getting those training zones right, in particular at that bottom end. So there's our first part. That's how we can look at it from building aerobic capacity. Most of us know we need to do the long, slow Ks and do the work, do the higher volume stuff. The other component that a lot of us are really familiar with is threshold. There's a couple of terms there: functional threshold, anaerobic threshold, lactate threshold. They get used interchangeably. We won't argue about the semantics of which one's a better term to use, but typically most of us agree that this is the intensity we can sustain for about 45 to 60 minutes. If we were to time trial it, that's what we'd be able to hold, whether it's power or pace. More simply, I like to look at it and think about it as the intensity at which, when we're working below it, we fatigue slower, and when we work above it, we fatigue much quicker. And this is shown when we measure blood lactate in the lab. Generally speaking, blood lactate accumulates quite gradually in the low intensities. And then we hit this point where it starts to accumulate quite rapidly. That point is our threshold, fundamentally. That's the key point in terms of percentage of the engine, because when we go above it, we're going to start fatiguing a bit quicker. So in most endurance circumstances, we want to work at and below it, pending the length of the event. Long course racing, like my photo here from 70.3, we want to be staying well below threshold to be able to make sure we can sustain that workload over a long period of time. In something like a 5K time trial or a 5K park run, you can probably work above threshold because we're not worried about fatiguing, because it's a much shorter event. It might be 20, 25 minutes, for example. Maybe even quicker if you're a really fast athlete. It's all really about how much of our aerobic engine can we practically use. What percentage of the engine have we got? And that's where we have a look at some data here from Ben, who's a long course triathlete. You can see it's from 2018. I know it's a bit old, but I really wanted to highlight this because it really clearly shows the difference in types of training and where we went and specifically targeted threshold to improve. So you can see in the blue line, that's his initial test. Pretty okay profile, starting from a really low base in that February of 2018. The orange line is from September. So we went through and did a really long, extensive base phase, not much racing throughout the middle of the year. Bit of off-season initially, then into a base phase where we mainly target his aerobic capacity and power. And you can see there's a good little uptick on what happened with VO2 max. We then started implementing a bit more specific threshold-based work leading into his racing season. And ultimately what we see is that green line. You can see it flatten off a little bit more at the bottom, but then push across to the right. We extend it out a bit further. We continued to improve his aerobic power. You can see VO2 max went up a bit more again. We went from 14 to 15 to 16 Ks an hour in each of those tests. So we're clearly improving overall as the size of the engine. But the percentage of his engine he could hold also is increasing. We're delaying the onset of that rapid accumulation that's really causing us to fatigue when we go above that intensity. So we're shifting that lactate graph to the right. Absolutely textbook for when we do that really specific threshold training, improving the percentage of the engine. In this case, we've got some improvement in the size of the engine as well. So it's a double whammy. Most of the time, we might use this and we might see VO2 max may not change, but instead of holding 80% of our VO2 max at threshold, we now might hold 85%. We can just increase how much we can use, which is going to be functionally beneficial from a training, but ultimately from a racing perspective as well. At the end of the day, threshold or velocity at threshold, power at threshold is a really key indicator of endurance performance. If everything's equal, if two athletes had a VO2 max of 60, both at 300 watts, one of them has an FTP of 270, one has an FTP of 250, the FTP of 270, more often than not, if all other conditions are equal, is probably going to win. So improving threshold, we all know, is really, really important. And this is the proof in terms of when we test in the lab, we can actually clearly identify how is threshold moving and implement some strategies to be able to improve it really effectively. You can see in that second test, that orange one, threshold may not have moved too much. VO2 max did a bit, but not so much threshold. The follow-up test in December, big improvement in threshold. That's a change in training stimulus and strategy to be able to target that specifically. So our last component here is aerobic power. This is the one that we probably emphasize the most here at Mets, purely because it's the maximum output from our aerobic system. It dictates everything else. Think about it as the size of the engine, really. It comes down to what is VO2 max, maximum amount of oxygen we can take in, transport, and utilize in a minute. Often a lot of people think about this as being the ceiling. I prefer to think about it, and we talk about it a lot, as being the size of the engine like a car engine. Are you a V6, a V8, or a V12? Being a V6 is good, but being a V8 is going to be more powerful. And whether that's increasing velocity at VO2 max or whether it's also increasing your oxygen consumption as well, having a bigger aerobic engine we can do more with at the top means sub-maximally, when we talk about percentage of your VO2 max, something like FTP or threshold, as we just touched on, or even our aerobic capacity is a lower percentage again, those all lift up when we've got a much bigger engine. And that's why the professional athletes are so fantastic and hold such high intensities for a long period of time. It's because their VO2 max is large in terms of oxygen consumption and number, 80, 85 plus, but the intensity they hold at VO2 max is also quite high as well. So let's have a look at a couple of examples of aerobic power. So this is Matt, who's a runner, specifically 1500, heavily reliant on his velocity at VO2 max to be able to be a really solid runner. What we did, orange line is initial test, blue line the second one. We're looking at FeO2 now. So looking at fraction of expired oxygen. And ultimately, it's a really fancy way of saying what bang for buck are we getting out of the air coming in. When we breathe in the air, not all of it's oxygen, but we want to try and extract as much of it as we can. So in simple terms, we want this FeO2 to reduce. We want this to be as low on the graph as we can, because it means we're breathing out less oxygen. We're actually using more internally in the system. And that's what you can see. We implemented some really specific high-intensity interval training using 95, 97% of VO2 max to be able to improve his aerobic power. And you can see by the length of the test there, clearly improved about 4 or so minutes further into the test as a result of going away and working specifically on that top end. What it also did is you can see as that blue line flows back down to the left, at those slightly lower intensities, we improved as well. So a byproduct of this, and I don't have the graph here, but a byproduct of this is we're using a better percentage of oxygen. So what Matt didn't actually have to do was breathe as much air. So his ventilation reduced at those lower intensities. Means when he's sitting in the pack and he's 1500, he's relaxed, he's calm, he doesn't have to work super hard. When he wants to go, he's got the ability to do it. He's got the extra speed to be able to use as well. So really clear improvement in aerobic power by implementing some really effective, strategic, high-intensity interval training. Coming back to our other Matt, our cyclist from before, we didn't just go away and work on his capacity. We used a bit more of a polarized model for this case. We worked on his aerobic power as well. And you can see the same result. That FeO2 significantly drops, extends further out to the right, so we get further into the test, can produce a greater output, size of the engine's increased. And what we actually found was it indirectly improved his FTP by being better at using oxygen more quickly. So as the intensity went up, he was able to use oxygen more quickly and more effectively. What that meant was blood lactate reduced. We delay the onset of accumulation, as we said before. Bang, FTP jumped up 20 to 30 watts. Our VO2 max went up about 30 or so watts, a little bit further as well. Massive improvement in his engine overall. And that was largely around doing a lot of the capacity work, but having really strategic, targeted aerobic power work well above threshold to boost the top end of the engine and improve his engine overall. So when it comes to what we typically see in the lab, this aerobic power aspect I find is probably one of the most critical ones, because this is the profile of the typical athlete I see. Now, I've performed well over 1,500 VO2 max tests for all different types of endurance athletes in the lab over the years, and this profile comes out more often than not. Really great aerobic capacity. A lot of athletes done the work, put in the high volume, really well done. Really fantastic lactate threshold for that at as well. They can hold a high percentage of the engine they've got. They're a V6 engine running on pretty close to 6 cylinders. That's great, but their limiting factor is how do we find ways to get them up to a V8 engine? How can we improve the top? And more often than not, it comes down to improving that aerobic power. We want to try and improve that FiO2. We want to delay the onset of fatigue, but largely get better at using oxygen more quickly. And as I said in those two examples, it comes down to really effective, targeted, high-intensity interval training. So here's a couple of sessions you might consider. Here's the two basic sessions that I give. One's a bit simpler than the other, but I give to be able to improve our aerobic power. Really great for boosting up the top end of the engine. Session 8 by 2 minutes at 95% of your VO2 max. If you're doing this running, the recovery is a walk. And so we can replicate that on the bike by doing a really, really light spin. Session B, quite similar. We're just mixing up some work to rest ratio there, 4 minute on, 3 minute off, but then also the intensity relative to our length of interval. So you can see the 4 minute effort, slightly lower intensity, 93 to 95%. The 2 minute interval, slightly higher. I'd probably say session A, a little bit more for the beginner getting used to this or trying this for the first time. Session B, a bit more advanced. You want a real challenge in this space. So that's why I put those two there. Neither session is the be-all and end-all. They're just great examples to maybe get you going and thinking about what you can do from a high-intensity interval perspective if aerobic power is a bit of a focus. The major thing you'll note here is, well, if I haven't done a lab test, what does 95% of VO2 max mean? I'm going to give you a bit of an example of how to get to that 95%. And it's by doing a really simple field test, whether you're on the bike or on the run. So we're looking for, from a cycling perspective, our maximal aerobic power, which you can do. Jump on Zwift, do the 1 minute ramp test, go up all the way as high as you can and take the final completed stage. So let's say you got all the way through and completed 300 watts. You completed that, but you only got 30 seconds into the next one. Take 300, that's your MAP. Most circumstances can be a 4 to 5 minute average power if you just did a single time trial, but I'd probably say the 1 minute ramp test is a bit more simple to administer in terms of, well, how hard am I pushing? It's controlled. If you jump on your kicker or jump on your smart trainer and do the test that way, really simple way of getting MAP. And then just take the percentage. If MAP is 300, 95% of 300 is 285. Bang, insert that into that session before. There's your 8 2-minute efforts and away we go. Running wise, very similar. We're looking at maximal aerobic speed and we're looking at average pace across a 1.6 to 2K time trial. I say 6 to 7 minute duration. We don't really want to exceed too much more than that. So if 2Ks is maybe going to take you 8 minutes, I'd probably go for something like a 1500 or a 1.6K time trial instead. If you feel like you're going to get through 2Ks a lot quicker than that, well, that's absolutely okay. But we don't want it getting too much longer than sort of that 7 minute duration. It starts to get a little bit lesser or underestimate our velocity at VO2 max. Again, take 95%, insert it in. But a really simple way that you can map all that out, get your data, we'll leave a link to it down below, is to jump on our METS conditioning catalog. So those two sessions I gave you just before are just two examples. We've got a conditioning catalogue of over 48 examples, running and cycling, all targeted specifically at improving aerobic power and VO2 max, long interval, short interval, all our staple basic type sessions in there. And there's actually a little calculator where you can put in your maximal aerobic power or your maximum aerobic speed, and it will calculate all of the sessions for you. So you can literally just jump on, have a look. All right, I want to do session 10 today. Bang, get straight into it. It'll tell you exactly what you need to do. Work to rest ratios, the lot. If you sort of implement some of that, you want to play around with it, and you think, you know what, next step is I really want to come into the lab and see exactly where I'm at, get some more refined information. That's where, let us know. Come on in, get involved in a METS lab test, come and do a VO2 max test with us. We're going to be able to build out some really specific training zones and take you through in a bit more detail how some of this information is really relevant to you. Are you fitting that typical profile of someone who needs to work on their aerobic power? Or maybe there's some opportunities of, you've got great aerobic power, but we need to work on aerobic capacity or lactate threshold, maybe in the background, or which ones actually make the most sense for you to work on right now based on your racing schedule. All of that additional info is what we can help you out with by coming in and doing a lab test. And if you have any questions about any of this at all, just email us. nick@metsperformance.com is a really simple way to get in touch with me. Happy to answer any of your questions and help you out in terms of implementing some of this information, particularly trying to implement some physiological data to be able to inform your training. It's a really, really important part of the process. We've seen some really great results with the athletes we've worked with, and over a number of different sports as well. We're not just specific to triathlon or cycling, for example. If you're an endurance athlete looking to get better, this is a really effective way to being able to pinpoint exactly where you need to go. So hopefully you got plenty out of this one. Again, if you have any questions about any of the process, whether it be testing, the conditioning catalog, any information we discussed, send me an email, nick@metsperformance.com. But I appreciate you joining us for this one, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.